Marcus Thorne tossed his third Rolex onto the mahogany table with a jarring clatter. He stood up, his face flushed with unbridled arrogance, as he pointed a finger directly at Maya Sterling, a black woman standing in calm, silent defiance. "Get this out of my sight!" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I don't shake hands with black women. Your presence alone cheapens this firm, and your ridiculous little investment proposal is nothing but a stain on my boardroom. You clearly don't know your place." He stepped closer, raking his eyes over her with revolting disdain. "Do you really think that cheap blazer and that skin tone belong in a room like this? You're lucky my security didn't drag you out by your hair the moment you stepped inside." As Maya remained motionless, his lip curled in a final insult. "Don't bother waiting for an apology. People like you are only here to serve, not to sit at my table. Now get out before I lose my patience." Maya didn't blink. She knew that in just a few minutes, his cruelty would become the catalyst for his total destruction. Don't miss this story of justice. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below and hit that subscribe button to follow the full takedown. Maya Sterling did not rush as she stepped out of the glass-walled headquarters and onto the bustling sidewalk of downtown Chicago. The city was alive, a symphony of honking taxis, hurried pedestrians, and the distant rhythmic rumble of the L train overhead. To any observer, she was just a woman in a modest charcoal blazer, disappearing into the lunchtime crowd. Yet beneath the calm exterior, her mind was a whirlwind of calculated precision. She was not the woman Marcus Thorne thought he had humiliated. She was, in fact, the silent architect behind Sterling Capital, a venture firm with over $14 billion in assets under management. She lived in a penthouse overlooking the lake, but she found the most peace in her small, hand-tended community garden on the city's south side. There she grew heritage tomatoes and rows of lavender, far away from the cutthroat boardrooms where men like Marcus measured worth by the thickness of a wallet or the sharpness of a tailor's stitch. Maya understood the world of high finance better than anyone, but she had never forgotten the feeling of the dirt between her fingers. She was a woman who had built her empire from a folding table in a basement, and she had long ago realized that people who needed to flaunt their wealth were usually the ones with the least amount of true power. Back in her office, a space that was minimalist, devoid of gold accents or towering ego-driven art, Maya sat down and looked at the framed photograph on her desk. It was her grandmother, a woman who had cleaned houses for 30 years to put Maya through college. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity was not a garment you wore. It was an armor you carried, one that no insult could penetrate. Maya pulled out her phone and checked her portfolio. The $150 million she had prepared to invest in Thorne and Associates was still sitting in a liquid holding account. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to stabilize Thorne's faltering infrastructure projects for the next 5 years. Marcus Thorne, however, was currently busy congratulating himself. He had cut the cleaning staff's hours by 20% that morning to trim the fat from his quarterly reports, bragging to his assistant that he was a visionary of efficiency. He sat in his office wearing 3 Rolexes, a habit he claimed brought him luck, and chuckled to himself about the uppity woman he had just dismissed. He didn't know that Maya was not just a potential investor. She was the missing piece that would have saved his failing legacy. He thought he had just insulted a stranger. He had no idea he had just insulted the one person who could turn the lights off on his entire career. Maya sighed, adjusted her glasses, and dialed her managing partner, David. "David," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the anger Marcus had expected. "The meeting didn't go as planned. In fact, it was quite revealing. I'm moving my focus elsewhere. But first, there is a small matter of due diligence we need to finalize regarding Thorne and Associates." Maya didn't want to destroy him for the sake of it. She wanted to expose the rot that he had cultivated in his halls. She began to draft a series of communications, not to Marcus, but to the industry regulators and the key stakeholders who had been kept in the dark about the company's internal health. She had spent months tracking Thorne and Associates, and she knew the cracks in their foundation were far deeper than any of them admitted. Marcus believed he was the king of the castle, but the castle was built on sand, and the tide was already beginning to rise. She spent the rest of the afternoon gathering her records, documenting every project Thorne had inflated and every liability he had hidden. By the time the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long, dramatic shadows across her desk, Maya had finished her work. She was ready. The humiliation in that boardroom hadn't broken her. It had simply cleared the smoke, leaving the target in perfect focus. She looked out at the city, a slight, knowing smile touching her lips. The game had not even begun, but she had already won. The next morning, Maya returned to the Thorne and Associates headquarters. This time, she didn't come to negotiate. She came to observe the environment she was about to dismantle. As she approached the main glass doors, the receptionist, a young woman who had barely looked up from her computer the day before, recognized her immediately. Her face stiffened, and her eyes darted to the internal security cameras mounted in the corners of the lobby. "Mr. Thorne is not seeing anyone today," the receptionist said, her tone sharp and practiced. "And frankly, I don't think you're allowed in this building anymore. The directive from management is very clear." Maya stood her ground, her posture relaxed but authoritative. "I'm not here for Mr. Thorne," she replied calmly. "I'm here to deliver a notice of withdrawal regarding the initial tender process." "You need to leave," the woman snapped. She then stood up and pointed toward the service entrance, a grimy, dimly lit corridor, usually reserved for freight elevators and trash collection. "If you refuse to exit through the main lobby, security will escort you out through the service tunnel. We don't want people like you lingering in the front, distracting our clients." The dehumanization was blatant. It was a cold, calculated attempt to make her feel invisible, to reduce her to a utility rather than a partner. Maya felt a sharp spike of anger, but she swallowed it down. She knew that reacting would only feed the narrative Marcus had built, that she was an agitated, irrational outsider. Instead, she took out her phone and subtly began recording the audio. She walked toward the service entrance, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythmic, steady beat. As she stepped into the service area, the smell of damp concrete and rotting organic waste hit her instantly. This was the environment Marcus forced his unwanted visitors into. The elevator was out of order, forcing her to walk past the janitor's closet. She saw an elderly employee, a man who had clearly been working since the crack of dawn, struggling to push a heavy, rusted cart filled with industrial-grade cleaning chemicals. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he saw Maya, he lowered his head, whispering, "I'm sorry, miss. They don't like us being seen by the executives." Maya paused. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said softly. She walked out into the alleyway behind the building, the sun barely piercing through the towering concrete monoliths of the business district. As she reached the end of the alley, she saw Marcus Thorne himself walking toward his chauffeur-driven sedan. He was flanked by 2 bodyguards, his 3 Rolexes glinting in the morning light, as he gestured wildly on his phone, laughing at some joke that was clearly at someone else's expense. He caught sight of Maya emerging from the service tunnel and smirked. "See?" he called out to his bodyguards, not bothering to lower his voice. "I told you she'd try to sneak back in. Probably looking for a job in the mailroom. It's a shame, really. Some people are just destined to spend their lives in the shadows, no matter how hard they try to climb into the light." He climbed into his car, the door slamming shut with a satisfying thud. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle peeled away, splashing a puddle of stagnant rainwater onto the hem of Maya's blazer. It was a petty, unnecessary act of disrespect. Maya stood still as the car disappeared into the traffic. She didn't wipe the mud off her sleeve. She needed to remember exactly what he stood for. Later that afternoon, back in her office, Maya finalized the strategy. She had discovered that Thorne and Associates had been engaged in a predatory practice. They were intentionally undervaluing minority-owned businesses to force them into disadvantageous buyouts, then flipping them for triple the price to larger corporations. This was not just unethical, it was a massive regulatory violation. She contacted the lead investigator at the Financial Conduct Authority, a person she had mentored years ago, and sent over the documents she had spent weeks compiling. Maya, the investigator said over the secure line, if this is true, his firm won't just lose the funding. He's looking at federal oversight that will shut them down for months. Why are you doing this? Because, Maya replied, staring at the screen that displayed a list of the 41 employees Marcus had fired just the previous month. No one else was going to stand up to him. He thinks he owns the room because he has the money, but he's forgotten that money is a resource, not a moral compass. She closed her laptop. The trap was set. She had leaked the information regarding Thorne's efficiency cuts to a major financial journalist known for her tenacity. By tomorrow morning, the news of Marcus Thorne's mistreatment of staff and his fraudulent business practices would be in the headlines of every major paper. The chaos was about to begin, and he wouldn't even see the hand that held the match. The tension within the halls of Thorne and Associates began to simmer at 9 a.m. sharp. Marcus Thorne walked into the office, his chest puffed out, fully expecting a day of sycophantic praise and profitable maneuvers. He sat at his mahogany desk, once again displaying his bizarre collection of 3 Rolex watches, one for London time, one for Tokyo, and one he claimed was for luxury standards. Though they were all set to local Chicago time, a small, glaring absurdity that his employees dared not mention. He leaned back, humming a tune, oblivious to the fact that his internal server was currently screaming. In the outer offices, the atmosphere was volatile. The email Maya had leaked to the press had hit the desks of every major financial reporter in the city. By 9:15 a.m., the phones began to ring, not from clients looking to invest, but from regulatory agencies asking for clarification regarding the firm's recent acquisitions. Marcus's CFO, Arthur Penhaligon, burst into the office, his face the color of wet chalk. He clutched an iPad, his hands trembling so violently that he nearly dropped it onto the glass desk. "Marcus, we have a massive problem," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. "The press. They have everything. The buyout records, the forced liquidations, and, God, they have the audio from the board meeting yesterday." Marcus didn't even look up from his phone. He was busy scrolling through his social media feed, hunting for compliments on a recent post about his visionary business tactics. "Put it on speaker, Arthur. You're always panicking over nothing. It's a smear campaign. Who's behind it? That woman from yesterday." "It's not just her," Arthur shouted, losing his composure entirely. "It's everyone. Every major investor is calling to retract their support. They're citing reputational risk. And Marcus, the EEOC, is at the front desk. They have a subpoena." Marcus finally stood up, his jaw tightening. "Tell them to wait. I'm in the middle of a strategic call." "There is no strategy left." Arthur threw the iPad onto the desk, the screen glowing with an article headline that read, "Predatory Practices at Thorne and Associates, CEO's Cruelty Exposed." Marcus pushed the device away as if it were contaminated. He marched out into the main workspace, his eyes scanning the room for someone to blame. He spotted a young analyst, a woman who had been with the company for 3 years, staring at the news feed on her computer. "What are you looking at?" Marcus barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Get back to work. Who gave you permission to browse the news?" The analyst looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "Mr. Thorne, we're all reading it. It's everywhere. You called her an animal. You said, 'I said what needed to be said to protect the integrity of this firm.'" Marcus roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. That woman was a distraction, a diversity hire attempting to infiltrate our circle of influence. If you don't like the way I run this company, pack your desk and get out. You're all replaceable. At that moment, the double doors at the far end of the office swung open. It wasn't the police and it wasn't the regulators. It was a delegation from the board of directors led by Catherine Ellis, the woman who held the deciding vote on Marcus's future. The entire office fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Marcus smoothed his suit, regaining his composure with the practiced ease of a man who believed his power was absolute. Catherine, I assume you're here to discuss the strategy for our expansion. The press is having a little tantrum, but I'm handling it. Catherine Ellis didn't stop walking until she was inches from him. She was an older woman with a sharp, iron-willed gaze that had seen more corporate empires fall than Marcus had ever built. She didn't look at his watches, and she didn't look at his suit. She looked at him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. The press isn't having a tantrum, Marcus, she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. The market is having an allergic reaction to you. You've brought shame to this board and exposed us to lawsuits that will drain our reserves for the next decade. Do you have any idea who the woman you humiliated yesterday was? Marcus laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. Some investor with a chip on her shoulder. I don't care if she's a billionaire. You don't walk into my building and expect me to bow down. She isn't just an investor. Catherine whispered the words, carrying more weight than a scream. She is the majority shareholder of the investment trust that has been secretly backing our liquidity for the last 2 years. She didn't come to you for a partnership, Marcus. She came to see if you were worth saving. You failed that test. And in doing so, you didn't just lose her money. You lost everything. Marcus felt the floor tilt. He looked around the room, hoping for a flicker of support from his senior executives, but they were all looking down studiously, avoiding his gaze. He was alone in the middle of his own empire, surrounded by people who were waiting for him to vanish. He felt the weight of his 3 Rolex watches. They suddenly felt like heavy shackles dragging his arms toward the ground. He had tried to be a titan, but he was nothing more than a small, angry man who had finally run out of doors to slam. The silence in the room was not just quiet. It was a physical weight, thick with the smell of expensive cologne and impending catastrophe. Marcus looked from Catherine to the rows of employees, his eyes darting frantically. He had spent his entire career cultivating an aura of invincibility, a narrative where he was the smartest person in any room. Now he was staring at the wreckage of his own design. You can't do this, Marcus stammered, his bravado finally cracking. I built this, every contract, every skyscraper, every dollar I negotiated them. You're going to let a single incident destroy 20 years of growth. This is madness. Catherine stepped back, her expression one of profound fatigue. It wasn't a single incident, Marcus. It was the moment the mask slipped. You've been bleeding this company's morale dry for years, but we tolerated it because the margins were high. Yesterday you crossed a line that no amount of profit can justify. You didn't just insult a partner. You insulted the principles this firm claims to uphold. And frankly, your obsession with performance metrics has blinded you to the fact that leadership is about people, not just tickers on a screen. One of the senior partners, a man Marcus had once publicly berated for a minor spreadsheet error, stood up. He walked over to Marcus's desk, picked up the iPad that Marcus had previously swiped away, and turned the screen toward the room. It displayed the live stock ticker for Thorne and Associates. The line was a sheer vertical drop, a plummet, that signaled a loss of millions in valuation in less than an hour. The market is moving faster than you, Marcus, the partner said coldly. And they aren't waiting for a press release. They're selling. Marcus felt a sharp stabbing pain in his chest, a somatic reaction to the collapse of his ego. He turned toward the boardroom, his sanctuary, but the double doors were already being guarded by two security officers he didn't recognize. They weren't his hand-picked guards anymore. They were the firm's emergency legal security tasked with ensuring a smooth transition of power. "You're stripping me of my authority!" Marcus shrieked, his voice climbing an octave. "I am the CEO. I have the majority of the voting rights." "Actually," Catherine countered, pulling a document from her leather folder, "the trust that Maya Sterling controls just exercised a clause in the secondary shares purchase agreement. They've successfully consolidated enough voting power to initiate an immediate vote of no confidence. It was filed at 9:30 a.m. this morning. It's not just a request, Marcus. It's an order." Marcus looked at the paper, his hands trembling so violently that the 3 Rolexes on his wrist clinked together in a cacophony of metal. It was a sound he had once cherished as a symbol of success. Now it sounded like a funeral bell. He looked at the faces around him, the analysts, the associates, the clerks. He had treated them like cogs in a machine, never realizing that he was the only part of the machine that was truly expendable. He lunged toward his office door to grab his personal belongings, but the security guards stepped forward, blocking his path. "Please, Mr. Thorne," one of them said, his tone devoid of any empathy. "We have been instructed to retrieve your company assets. Your personal items will be collected by the transition team and shipped to your residence by the end of the day." "I need my files, my private records," Marcus shouted. His face contorted in rage. He tried to push past the guard, but the man didn't budge a mountain of granite compared to Marcus's frantic, disorganized energy. "Mr. Thorne, please," Catherine repeated, her voice cutting through his hysterics. "Do not make this any more undignified than it already is. You have 5 minutes to leave the premises. If you remain beyond that, we will be forced to escalate this to a physical removal." Marcus looked at his reflection in the glass wall of his own office. He looked small. His suit, tailored to perfection, suddenly seemed like a costume that didn't fit. He looked down at his wrist, finally noticing how absurd the 3 watches looked, a desperate display of a man who tried to control time only to be consumed by it. He pulled them off one by one and set them on the cold floor. He didn't want them anymore. They didn't tell the time. They only counted down the seconds he had left in the world he thought he owned. He walked toward the elevator, his steps echoing in the vast, empty space. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye to the people he had terrorized for a decade. He simply stepped into the lift, the doors closing, with a soft, final hiss that seemed to mock his exit. As the elevator began its descent, he caught his own eyes in the mirror. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a leader. He saw a man who had built his house on hate, only to realize that hate was the wind that had blown his own walls down. He wasn't thinking about his lost money or his lost power. He was thinking about Maya Sterling and how she hadn't even needed to raise her voice to break him. She had simply held up a mirror, and he hadn't been able to stand what he saw. The lobby of Thorne and Associates was a graveyard of ambition. As the elevator doors slid open, Marcus stepped out, bracing himself for a storm of cameras and reporters. He was right. The building's entrance had been transformed into a chaotic press pool. Flashbulbs erupted like miniature lightning storms, blinding him, and a cacophony of questions hammered at his skull. "Marcus, how do you respond to the allegations of discrimination? Is it true you're being sued for breach of fiduciary duty? What did you say to the investor you humiliated?" He pushed through this crowd, his head down, his tailored jacket ruffled. He felt like a caged animal being prodded by hungry spectators. His chauffeur-driven sedan was nowhere to be seen. It had been recalled by the firm's new management. He was left standing on the curb of Michigan Avenue, a man who had commanded billions, now unable to even summon a car. Miles away in her quiet, sunlight-drenched office, Maya Sterling sat perfectly still. She wasn't watching the news. She didn't need to see the spectacle of his downfall. She knew the mechanics of it too well. She was looking at a spreadsheet detailing the reallocation of the $150 million he had so recklessly dismissed. Her managing partner David stood by the window watching the live coverage of the firm's implosion. "The board just appointed an interim CEO," David said, turning around. "They're offering a full audit of all operations for the last 5 years, specifically focused on the accounts where they flagged irregular practices. They're also looking for a lead partner to guide the restructuring. They asked if we had any recommendations." Maya looked up, her expression unreadable. "Tell them to contact the organizations we've been quietly supporting, the ones Marcus spent years trying to suppress. Give them the names of the talent he deemed unsuitable for his corporate culture. Let's see what happens when the people he stepped on are given the keys to the kingdom." "You're really going to help them fix it?" David asked, intrigued. "I'm going to make sure that the culture of that firm is scrubbed clean," Maya replied. "He wanted to maintain a certain look. Now he's going to watch as the very people he deemed unworthy rebuild the foundation of the house he tried to burn down. It's not about revenge, David. It's about balance." Back on the street, Marcus finally managed to flag down a taxi. He threw himself into the back seat, breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared out the window as the skyline he had helped shape blurred past him. Every glass tower, every steel beam seemed to mock him. He had spent his life trying to project strength, but he realized now that he had been brittle all along. His phone buzzed incessantly, a torrent of messages from old associates, lawyers, and even his ex-wife. He didn't open them. He knew exactly what they contained: distance. People were already beginning to treat him like a social contagion. The irony was suffocating. He had prioritized status above all else, and in a single day, his status had been reduced to 0. He instructed the driver to take him to his estate in the suburbs, a sprawling hollow monument to his ego that he had rarely enjoyed. As he passed through the iron gates, he realized he wasn't going to a home. He was going to a tomb of his own making. He stepped out of the taxi and walked toward the front door, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He reached for his key, but his hand stopped. He stood there for a long time, looking at the silent house. He remembered Maya's hand extended toward him in that boardroom. It had been steady, open, and utterly calm. He had recoiled from it, blinded by his own prejudices, convinced that he was the one with the upper hand. He hadn't realized that the moment he refused to shake her hand, he was declaring war on the very foundations of his own success. He didn't unlock the door. He sat down on the cold stone steps of his porch, the weight of the day settling over him like lead. He had no more meetings to attend, no more investors to bully, and no more titles to hide behind. The silence of the house was absolute, and for the first time Marcus Thorne was forced to listen to the only voice he had ever tried to drown out: his own conscience. It was a terrifying sound. In the city, the restructuring had already begun. The new board of directors had released a formal statement distancing the firm from the individual actions of the former CEO, and announcing a massive shift toward inclusive investment practices. It was a necessary PR move, but Maya wasn't interested in the politics of their apology. She was already on to her next project, a microfinancing initiative for entrepreneurs in the city's under-resourced neighborhoods. She closed her files and stood up, reaching for her coat. She had a meeting at 6 p.m. and she wasn't about to be late. She walked out of her office, a woman in a modest charcoal blazer, disappearing once again into the city, this time with the satisfaction of knowing that the balance had finally shifted. The shockwave from Marcus Thorne's termination did not dissipate, it amplified. Within 48 hours, the financial news cycle had transformed from a local business scandal into a national moral reckoning. Andrea Collins, an investigative reporter known for her bulldog tenacity, had received the audio recording of the boardroom confrontation from an anonymous source, a mid-level analyst who had been present when Marcus called Maya an animal. The audio played on national television at prime time. The sound quality was crisp, capturing every tremor of Marcus's arrogance and every ounce of his venom. "I don't shake hands with black women." The words hung in the air of millions of living rooms across America. It wasn't just a business disagreement anymore. It was a visceral, unfiltered display of bigotry that made even the most staunch corporate apologists recoil. The fallout was instantaneous. By the time the news segment ended, 3 major municipal pension funds had pulled their remaining assets from Thorne and Associates, citing a total lack of ethical leadership. Marcus Thorne, hiding in his silent estate, watched the news with a hollowed-out expression. He saw his own face plastered across the screen, juxtaposed with images of the employees he had fired and the diverse entrepreneurs he had systematically shut out of his deals. He had spent years believing that his tough persona was his greatest asset. He realized now that it was a neon sign pointing directly to his moral bankruptcy. He reached for his phone to call his lead counsel, but the lawyer's voicemail was already full. The transition had become a desertion. Meanwhile, at the Thorne and Associates headquarters, the office was a shell. The new leadership was scrambling to maintain operations, but the damage to the company's reputation was tectonic. During the emergency board meeting on Wednesday morning, Catherine Ellis stood before the remaining executives. She had been tasked with reviewing the internal archives Marcus had left behind. "I have spent the last 36 hours going through the digital logs," Catherine told the room, her voice devoid of its usual professional warmth. Not only did Mr. Thorne engage in discriminatory hiring, but he actively sabotaged our potential partnerships with any firm led by people of color. He created a shadow ledger, a list of undesirable firms that we were forbidden from doing business with. And guess who was at the top of that list? She clicked a remote, and a document appeared on the projection screen. It was an internal memo titled Strategic Exclusion, dated 3 years prior. At the very top, in bold black ink, was the name Sterling Capital Group, CEO Maya Sterling. The room gasped. One of the senior partners, a man who had worked under Marcus for a decade, covered his face with his hands. "We didn't know," he whispered. "He told us she was a high-risk liability." "He lied to you," Catherine snapped. "He didn't care about risk. He cared about power. And because of his fragility, he cost this company its most valuable potential ally." The ripple effect reached the markets by noon. Investors who had initially taken a wait-and-see approach now panicked. They realized that Marcus Thorne hadn't just been a difficult boss. He had been a systematic liability. The dominoes began to fall in rapid succession. Apex Financial, the firm's largest minority investor, sued for fraud. Global Logistics, a massive client, announced they were terminating their contract effective immediately. The company's stock price entered a death spiral, hitting a record low by the time the closing bell rang on Wall Street. Marcus Thorne finally cracked. He drove back to the city, his car inconspicuous, his suit wrinkled. He wasn't going to the office. He was heading to the law firm that had once been his closest ally. He needed a defense, a strategy, anything to stop the bleeding. But when he arrived at the high-rise on Wacker Drive, he was stopped at the front desk. "Mr. Thorne," the receptionist said, her eyes shifting nervously. "My instructions are to inform you that we are no longer representing you. You should have received the notification via courier this morning." "You can't do this," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing through the opulent lobby. "I've paid this firm millions. We have a retainer agreement." "That agreement had a morality clause," a voice said from behind him. It was the firm's senior partner, a man Marcus had played golf with for years. He didn't even stop walking. He just glanced at Marcus over his shoulder. "Your actions aren't just a professional liability, Marcus. They're a stain. We don't defend stains. Good luck." Marcus was left standing in the middle of the lobby, the same marble-floored, high-end environment he had once used as his own personal stage. He felt a sudden sharp realization. He had spent his life building a world where only money mattered, and now that world had decided he was no longer a profitable investment. He looked around the lobby, seeing a reflection of his own isolation. He had treated everyone as a means to an end, and now he had reached his own end alone. The irony was that he was still a wealthy man. He had millions in his personal accounts, but he had never been more bankrupt. He had lost the one thing he didn't know: how to value his relevance in a society that had finally stopped playing by his rules. He turned and walked out into the cold Chicago wind, a man who had finally realized that the world didn't need him, but he desperately needed a world that had already moved on. The climax of the firm's destruction was not a singular event, but a relentless mechanical dismantling of everything Marcus Thorne stood for. By Friday morning, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, had arrived at the Thorne and Associates headquarters with a federal warrant. They weren't just looking for records of the board meeting. They were looking for the digital fingerprint of a decade-long system of exclusion. As the investigators moved through the office, seizing hard drives and scanning decades of internal memos, Marcus Thorne sat in the back of his darkened home office in the suburbs. He had stopped answering the door. The press was camped out at the edge of his driveway, a constant buzzing reminder that he was no longer the hunter but the prey. He stared at his laptop screen, the brightness hurting his eyes, reading an article from the Financial Chronicle that detailed the Thorne legacy, a legacy now redefined as a masterclass in corporate hubris and racial animosity. In the heart of the city, at the Sterling Capital headquarters, the mood was vastly different. Maya Sterling was not celebrating. She was working. Her office was a flurry of activity, not because of a stock market crash, but because of a breakthrough. She was in the final stages of closing an investment deal that would seed 20 new startups led by Black and Latina women. These were founders who had been told no by firms like Thorne and Associates, founders who had been asked to wait in corridors, founders who had been told their ideas didn't fit the corporate profile. "Maya," David said, stepping into her office and placing a cup of coffee on her desk. "The board of Thorne and Associates just confirmed that they're liquidating the assets Marcus personally owned within the firm. They're also formally inviting us to lead the restructuring project. They want to know your terms." Maya took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving the screen where she was reviewing a pitch deck for a promising AI-driven education platform. "My terms are simple, David. First, full transparency on the hiring audit. Every employee fired in the last year because of cultural fit must be offered their job back with a full settlement. Second, the $150 million I originally intended to invest. It's now going into the minority business fund we discussed. They'll manage it, but we'll hold the oversight keys." David smiled, a genuine look of admiration crossing his face. He's going to be livid when he hears that his company is being restructured using his own money to support the exact people he despised. "He doesn't get a vote anymore," Maya said, her voice devoid of malice, just cold, hard fact. "That's the thing about power, David. Marcus thought it was a sword he could wield to cut others down. He never realized it's more like a crop. If you don't nourish the soil, eventually the harvest dies." The legal proceedings were moving at a breakneck pace. On Saturday, a process server finally managed to bypass the press and serve Marcus with the civil lawsuit Maya had filed personally. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the defamation and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit included an affidavit signed by every member of the 12-person board who had witnessed the boardroom humiliation. They had all, to a person, chosen to speak the truth. They had realized that hitching their wagons to Marcus Thorne was a direct path to professional suicide. Marcus sat in his leather chair, the legal documents spread out before him like a death sentence. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his sister, the only person left who might listen. He didn't press the button. What could he say? I lost it all. Because I couldn't treat a human being with basic dignity, the words tasted like ash. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. Marcus jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and walked toward the foyer. A protest had formed. It wasn't violent, it was a silent, powerful vigil. Dozens of young entrepreneurs, former employees of Thorne and Associates, and advocates for equity were standing in front of his gates. They held signs that featured the faces of the people Marcus had tried to erase. There was no shouting, no throwing of stones, just a wall of human presence, a silent testament to the fact that his empire had been built on air. Marcus stared at them through the thick, reinforced glass of his front door. He felt a profound, shivering sense of vertigo. These were the people he had called unworthy, the people he had kept out of his boardrooms, the people he had deemed irrelevant. And now they were the ones who had gathered to watch his silence. He realized then that the destruction of his company was only the beginning. The destruction of his identity was already complete. He had lived for the admiration of an elite circle that had now discarded him, and he had spent his life stepping on the very people who were now standing in judgment of his actions. He backed away from the door, retreating into the shadows of his hallway. He had no more Rolexes to check, no more meetings to influence, and no more power to protect. He was just a man in a big house finally understanding that the only thing more dangerous than a man with power is a man who thinks he has the right to use it to diminish others. The trial of Marcus Thorne versus Maya Sterling and the state of Illinois commenced in the early crisp days of November. The courtroom was a masterclass in atmospheric tension. The gallery was packed reporters, former employees, and representatives from the various financial institutions that had once bowed to Marcus's every whim. Now they sat in the back, recording the spectacle of his downfall. Marcus sat at the defense table looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 weeks. His suit was expensive, but it hung loosely on his frame. He didn't have his watches, and he didn't have his team of loyalists. He was represented by a court-appointed public defender who looked exhausted, tasked with the impossible job of humanizing a man the entire world had already judged. Maya Sterling took the stand on the second day. She wore a simple navy blue suit, no jewelry, her presence commanding the room without a single theatrical gesture. The prosecutor led her through the sequence of events with surgical precision. Ms. Sterling, when you arrived at Thorne and Associates on that morning, what was your stated purpose? I was there to propose a strategic partnership, Maya said, her voice resonant and clear. A $150 million investment that would have secured the firm's solvency for the upcoming fiscal quarter. I had the term sheets, the market analysis, and the full backing of my firm. And when you entered the boardroom, what occurred? Maya recounted the meeting. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't add flowery prose or emotional embellishment. She stated the facts. She described the way Marcus had looked at her, the way he had dismissed her presence, and then she repeated the words that had effectively ended his career. He stood 3 feet from me, Maya said, her eyes fixed on the jury. He looked at my hand, then at my face, and he said, I don't shake hands with black women. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a heartbeat. The prosecutor then played the audio. The courtroom filled with the harsh, grating sound of Marcus Thorne's voice, raw, unfiltered, and deeply ugly. When the audio finished, the room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Marcus Thorne stared at the floor. His lawyers had advised him not to testify, but in a moment of desperate hubristic impulse, he insisted on taking the stand. It was the final mistake of a career defined by them. He stood in the witness box, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden railing. The prosecutor's cross-examination was swift and lethal. Mr. Thorne, you pride yourself on being a visionary in the financial sector, correct? You have an eye for talent, an eye for opportunity. I do, Marcus muttered. And yet you missed the fact that the woman standing in your boardroom was one of the most powerful institutional investors in the country. Was your decision to insult her based on a business assessment, or was it based on your belief that by virtue of her race she was inferior to you? I was under a lot of stress. Marcus stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a frantic sweating desperation. I didn't mean it in a way that was harmful. I didn't think she belonged there. Belonged where Mr. Thorne, the prosecutor pressed. In the room or at the table? Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The jury watched him, 12 people who had spent their lives dealing with the realities of the world, people who recognized the scent of prejudice when it was presented to them in high-definition audio. They weren't looking at a CEO. They were looking at a man who had weaponized his status to dehumanize a peer. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 12 minutes. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts of workplace discrimination, defamation, and creating a hostile work environment. The damages awarded to Maya Sterling were not just significant. They were a record-breaking amount meant to serve as a deterrent. But for Marcus, the financial penalty was secondary to the finality of the judgment. As the judge read the sentence, he spoke with a cold, stern authority that stripped away the last remnants of Marcus's corporate persona. Mr. Thornpower is not a permit to be cruel. You have demonstrated a fundamental lack of understanding regarding the dignity of your fellow human beings. You believed that because you occupied a position of authority, you could dictate the value of others. Today, this court makes it clear your authority is gone, but your accountability remains. Marcus was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look for a friendly face. As he walked past the press row, he finally caught Maya's eye. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply looking at him with a profound, calm pity. It was the look one gives to a broken object. He was escorted into the back of a police van, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him, cutting off the light of the afternoon sun. He had spent his life chasing a version of success that required him to shrink everyone else. Now he was in a space where his influence, his money, and his pedigree were completely and utterly irrelevant. In the courtroom lobby, Maya was surrounded by reporters, but she kept her statement brief. She stepped up to the microphone, her silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the city courthouse. "Today isn't about me," she said, her voice steady. "It's about the reality that in this country, dignity is not something you are granted by a CEO. It is an inherent right. We will continue to build, we will continue to invest, and we will continue to show up in every room we enter, not because we need permission, but because we belong." She turned and walked out of the courthouse, not toward a waiting limousine, but toward the busy city sidewalk, joining the crowd of people who were all in their own way simply moving forward. The aftermath of the trial was swift and sweeping. Thorne and Associates, under the guidance of the new board and the structural oversight of the investment trust Maya Sterling commanded, was rebranded. The name Thorne was stripped from the glass facade, replaced by a simple neutral designation, Apex Equity Group. It was a symbolic erasure that felt like a surgical removal of a long-standing infection. The Minority Business Investment Fund Maya had insisted upon became a beacon for the city's entrepreneurial spirit. Within 6 months, the fund had backed over 80 startups. These weren't just token investments. They were high-growth enterprises led by founders who had previously been pushed into the shadows. The downtown headquarters, once a place of fear and exclusion, now hosted evening seminars, mentorship workshops, and networking events for students from the local inner-city colleges. Douglas Crane, the CFO, who had once been Marcus's sycophant, became the firm's interim leader during the transition. He had been spared prosecution because he had turned state's evidence revealing the shadow ledgers and the systemic bias Marcus had enforced. He had spent his final days in the office writing personal letters of apology to every employee who had been wrongfully terminated. When he finally locked his office door for the last time, he walked out into a life of relative obscurity, forever haunted by the silence he had chosen to maintain that day in the boardroom. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, lived out his days in a quiet rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. His estate had been sold at public auction to settle the civil damages awarded to Maya and the class action lawsuits brought by the former staff. The Rolexes, the three symbols of his self-imposed luck, had been sold to a pawn shop, their market value barely covering a fraction of his legal fees. He was no longer a name that commanded attention. He was a footnote in a textbook on corporate ethics, a cautionary tale taught in MBA programs across the country. One rainy October afternoon, Maya stood in the lobby of a newly opened incubator center in downtown Chicago. The center was funded by her foundation and occupied the space that had once been an auxiliary office for Marcus's firm. She watched a group of young, diverse engineers working on a project at a shared mahogany table, the very table that had once been the center of the boardroom where she was told she didn't belong. She noticed a young woman, a 22-year-old engineering student named Nia, sitting at the head of the table. Nia was directing the team, her voice calm and authoritative, her eyes focused on the screen. She reminded Maya of herself decades earlier when the world was smaller and the obstacles felt like mountains. Maya walked over. Nia looked up, her face lighting up with a mix of awe and recognition. "Ms. Sterling, I read about what you did. You changed everything for us." Maya smiled, a gentle human expression that never reached the boardrooms of the past. "I didn't change anything, Nia. You did. You showed up, you did the work, and you took the space that was yours all along. I just helped open the door." "Do you ever think about him?" Nia asked, gesturing toward the city skyline where the old Thorne and Associates building stood. "Do you ever think about what he lost?" Maya looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the raindrops trace patterns on the glass. "He didn't lose his money, Nia. He didn't lose his title. He lost the ability to see the world as it actually is. He spent his life building a cage, and he was so busy decorating it that he didn't realize he was the one inside. I don't think about what he lost. I think about what we gained." She left the center as the sun began to set, the city lights flickering to life in the gathering dusk. She walked alone, a woman in a modest coat blending into the tapestry of the city. She didn't have an entourage, and she didn't have a driver waiting at the curb. She simply walked toward the subway, just another face in the crowd. She was a billionaire, an architect of industry, and a force of nature, yet she remained exactly who she had always been. A person who knew that her value was not something to be negotiated, but something to be lived. In the silence of his small apartment, Marcus Thorne opened a business magazine he had picked up at the grocery store. On the cover was a photo of the new entrepreneurship center. He saw Maya Sterling's name mentioned in the sub-headline, described as the woman who turned humiliation into a movement. He set the magazine down and looked out his window at the gray, featureless street. There was no rage left, only a deep, hollow understanding. He had fought so hard to be the king of a room that in the end didn't want him, and in the process he had missed the entirety of the life that had been happening outside his windows all along. The story had moved on, and so had the world. Dignity is not a title, a paycheck, or a suit. It is the unwavering knowledge of your own worth, even when those around you refuse to see it. True power isn't found in how many people you can force to bow, but in how many doors you can open for others. Never let the ignorance of small-minded people dictate the size of your horizon. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their value. Comment below How would you have handled the boardroom if you were in Maya's position? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories that change the way we see the world.